Somos Viña.
We are Vineyard.
Every sinful, and sometimes I qualify and say every unhealthy behavior is rooted in a legitimate God-given appetite. I've gone so far as to say, and I don't know if I would die on this hill, that there are no such thing as unholy desires. There are only desires that are misdirected desires. I don't know if it was Thomas Merton or a Celtic saint long before that who said there is only sacred and desecrated, no unsacred things. There are only holy and misdirected desires. Dallas Willard's writing and teaching, he's the one who coined the phrase sin management. Most churches preach a gospel of sin management, and there's nowhere where that probably stands out more explicitly than with sexuality, where we just try to ratchet it down. And I love the quote by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who said the pursuit of purity is not about suppressing our lust, but about reorienting our life to a larger goal. It's about what is it that we're seeking? We have to identify the God-given legitimate desire beneath. I love Proverbs 27, verse 7, I believe. The writer says that the one who is full loathes honey, but to the one who is hungry, what is bitter tastes sweet. And so we could argue that, pornography looks sweet and sexual acting out looks sweet, but ultimately it becomes bitter, especially when it's discovered or found out, or when our spouse or partner or elder group, learns of this. It's very, very bitter. And the antidote is not to ask Jesus to, help us flex our muscles and to resist sin. And to your point, there's a time and a place for that. But the antidote is to seek out that which fills our soul.
Welcome to the We Are Vineyard podcast, conversations to help us grow with Jesus and each other. This week's episode is a continuation of our Leadership Under Pressure series. In this episode, Jay will be talking with Michael Cusick. Michael is an author, a licensed professional counselor, and the host of the Restoring the Soul podcast. Let's listen in.
Michael, thank you for joining us for our podcast. We've already been laughing a lot, so I'm trying to dial it in and be serious. Thanks for willing to do this.
Oh, Jay, it's so good to be here. So looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, it'll be exciting. I've read a bunch of your stuff. I've followed you at a distance. I feel a little like a stalker, so this is exciting for me because we've only met in passing a few times. We have a bunch of mutual friends, but I have so admired your work. So I'm excited. So let's start where every good story starts, which is where were you born and where'd you grow up?
I was born in a hospital so I could be near my mom. I was very close to her.
Strong start.
I told you before we started I was going to try to crack you up. So
you can do it. I'm easy.
Dad humor. So I've lived in Colorado 33 years, but I was born and raised in Cleveland, Ohio, what we used to call the Mistake by the Lake.
Wow.
I was the youngest of 5 kids in an Irish Catholic, very devout but alcoholic family. Went to my first AA meeting when I was 5 years old, where I started my first addiction, where I took the styrofoam cup, filled it up halfway with black sludge coffee from the 40-cup pot my dad would make as the group secretary. He'd arrive early. And then I would take a sugar pourer and pour in the sugar until the coffee rose all the way up to the top. And then I would drink the coffee. True story, at 5 years old. At 9 years old, as the youngest of 5, my family moved across the country from Cleveland to Fort Lauderdale to join a family drug rehab program for my brother, who was 6 years older than me, and struggled with alcohol and drugs his whole life and eventually lost the battle to those. And then began a sex addiction around the age of 16 after years of sexual abuse. So, as I talk with people, my background is as an academic and professor, as a licensed therapist and spiritual director, but I always have to qualify that the thing that probably most informs me is my own life story and my own unintentional deep encounters with God. And I say unintentional because time and time again, I found myself in places of brokenness that I never expected or planned for, but nonetheless that God has used to bring some profound experience of him and some profound healing and wholeness that I also never expected because I didn't know how to get there. All I knew was striving and trying harder to be a good Christian.
Yeah. Okay, so let's back up a few steps because what's interesting is I'm from Columbus, Ohio, home of the Ohio State University. That's right. That's where I'm from, the heart of it all. So we're both from the heart of it all. I did not know that. And you're raised in this home where apparently your dad is aware of his addictive tendencies if you're kind of going to AA meetings when you're 5. So that's a pretty big deal. Were you in church?
Yeah, we grew up. I grew up Roman Catholic,
Okay.
which has been a really significant part of my life. My
Yeah.
dad passed away 10 years ago with 46 continuous years of sobriety.
Wow.
He had 5 years and then went off the wagon and then came back to AA and was sober for 46 years. And a beautiful story is he was in hospice for the last 14 or 15 days of his life, and he wasn't all there mentally. And so he gathered together the younger men that he had sponsored in Alcoholics Anonymous and told them that he couldn't get out of his new apartment where he was living, and he held an AA meeting in hospice. And it's one of the last things he did. And I treasure that as a picture of the kind of generativity and other-centeredness that I hope to have until the end of my life, where out of the fruits of my own brokenness, God does the best things and the deepest things.
Yeah. Wow, that's really powerful. And so you said you were Roman Catholic. That was like really helpful for you. You said that was a good thing. And so that means from an early age, church, a life with God is in the center of your life. It's towards the edge. Is it like kind of?
Well, one of my mentors once said to me, he said, you really didn't grow up as much Catholic as you grew up 12-step. And I would say that our church really was the 12 steps, but I had an aunt that was a cloistered Carmelite nun and a cousin who was a Holy Cross brother. And my aunts and uncles prayed for me to be a priest. I was the last great hope as the youngest one.
Yeah.
And for a very brief period of time, I actually considered that when I was in high school. But interestingly, in the Catholic Church, the confirmation, which of course other denominations do, is that period right around junior high where you kind of affirm your faith. And right around the time I did that in the late 70s, parents started saying to children, and mine did this, after you make your confirmation, you're kind of done and you don't have to go to church anymore, and whatever you believe is fine. And they just kind of wanted that rite of passage to happen. So I did my confirmation in the Catholic Church, and I was baptized in the Catholic Church as well. And then for about 4 years, I declared myself an agnostic, didn't go to church much. And then at 16, that wonderful incarnational ministry of Young Life, I encountered the good news for the first time that God was personal, that he loved me, that he didn't want a life of devotion and obedience in order to gain his affection, but that affection and embrace was already there. And that changed my life. And that's when I almost immediately said, I want to do this for the rest of my life. I was discipled in a profound and beautiful way by Joel Larisha and Jeff Cokwell and Cleveland Young Life. And I'm forever grateful for that. But the minute that conversion happened when I was 16, the sexual abuse that I had experienced from about the age of 4 until then, that all went underground. And I promised myself that nobody would ever know that. And then I went to another leader in my life who was impacting my faith, and I shared these things despite my promise. And they said, well, you're a new creation in Christ. The old is gone, the new has come. And so just kind of, keep doing ministry, and that should take care of itself. And that was the death knell for me. That was the nail in the coffin where I said, that's it. And I really set out to try to work hard for God and to do for God and to do ministry. And the more I did that, the more my heart got buried, the more my brokenness was relegated and hidden, and came to just live with chronic shame and anxiety. And then in college, I started to develop a full-blown sex addiction that would go on to nearly destroy my marriage, and also an alcohol issue, which I swore would never happen in light of my dad and my brother and many, many aunts and uncles.
Wow. So from that moment in Young Life, you're like, I'm doing ministry. This is the whole thing. So do you go to like Bible college? Do you do like theological training, or how do you start to work that out by way of education?
Yeah, I'm not bragging, but as a 16, 17, 18-year-old person, people would say I was the most disciplined person that they knew. I had a clipboard with like 10 different spiritual disciplines, and every day I would try to check the boxes, and I'd go for 2 weeks, and then I would stop because I would masturbate or look at porn from Playboys that I found in dumpsters. And then I thought God hated me, and then I would somehow work my way out of that pit of shame, and then start to perform for God again. And I did the 6 a.m. Saturday morning Bible studies and memorized scripture, went to the some of your listeners may not remember the name Bill Gothard and what used to be called the Institute in Basic Youth Conflicts.
Oh, yeah.
This conference that would tell you exactly how to, live life with God and how to master the Christian life and overcome any sin in your life. And the harder I tried, the deeper my brokenness got buried. And until fast forward, I graduated after 6 wonderful years for a 4-year degree. I couldn't graduate because my GPA was too low because I was doing ministry and working, and I just didn't care back then. I was depressed and addicted and wouldn't go to final exams. So I took education classes for 2 years, discovered that I was a teacher, and finally was able to graduate. I got my GPA up high enough at Cleveland State University. Started working after graduating, started working in mental health. And then my life blew up because one day I opened up the Cleveland Blaine Dealer newspaper and it said FBI raids escort service right across the top fold. And the FBI had raided, the office of this prostitution ring and to get past all the euphemisms of escort service. And there was a quarterback and a local news celebrity that were implicated in this, and their names were in there. And so I was terrified and thought I'd be exposed and pictured myself in an orange jumpsuit with handcuffs. And 24 hours later, I was in a Christian counselor's office for the first time in my life.
Wow.
And in that Christian counselor's office, I would have been 23 years old.
Still single, not married.
Still single.
Okay.
And he said, "How can I be of help?" And I talked for 50 minutes nonstop.
Wow.
And I told him everything. I told him about sexual abuse. I told him about every way that I had acted out. I told him about the newspaper article, pretty much just beating myself up and telling him how bad I was. And at the end of it, he lifted his watch very conspicuously, said, "We're out of time. And I have a question and a comment." First, the comment. And he said, "You strike me as a very lonely man." And that was like it just knocked the wind out of me, that's blowing my gut, because I was a young life leader and I was funny and I could get kids to, come to club and people loved me. And yet he saw something in me that I never put words to. And that I was desperately, desperately lonely. I was really good at kind of playing the good Christian game. Probably so many of us in ministry know that on Sunday morning, people are all around us and we're adored and we're loved. And then we go home lonely. Interestingly, one of the times where people in ministry, pastors or otherwise, act out the most is Sunday afternoon and Sunday evenings, because they're so depleted and poured out. And like Janis Joplin, who said, I can make love to an audience of 20 or 40,000 people in a concert and then go home lonely. And it's one of the most unbearable things. I had that experience all the time in ministry. So he put words to, "You are lonely." And then he said, "And now the question." This was all within the span of 60 seconds as, I'm getting ready to walk out the door. "You strike me as a lonely man. And now the question, are you ever at a loss for words?" and I was like, dude, that's socially inappropriate. You don't say that. By the way, I'm paying you money to, tell me what to do to overcome this. But what he did brilliantly, and I believe he was led by the Spirit of God, was rather than come at me and say, "We're going to treat you for addiction," or something like that, because I would have walked out and not come back. By then I was so cynical and jaded about that faith could really do anything. He put words to these longings in my heart. These, as Thomas Aquinas said, that every sinful behavior is rooted in a legitimate God-given longing. And he was putting words without doing a sermon or getting out a whiteboard, that it was actually longing for connection and for relationship that was driving me to go to prostitutes and strip clubs and bars to pick up women and to look at porn. And are you ever at a loss for words? That I was somehow using the acumen, the skill, the gift I was given with humor and being able to spiel and repartee, that I was actually holding him at a distance, that I wasn't actually letting him get close. I was just going to download and then expect him to be an expert with me, not to relate to me as a person or to see me, but just kind of have this very safe relationship. And it wasn't very safe in that moment. I remember thinking, I don't know what just happened, but I don't like it. And I think I want more of this.
Wow. Because
I felt seen and known for the first time. And back then we didn't use language like, people doing memes and on Instagram about being seen and compassion and things like that. That was brand new. And it really felt terrifying to be seen like that. And it even felt shameful to have him say, are you ever at a loss for words? And yet he did it with such kindness. And I'll never forget the look in his eyes of just kindness and compassion. And so ultimately I felt safe. I went out to the parking lot, sat in my car as a 23-year-old, and I just said, God, I don't know what you're doing, but there's something here. Next couple of years, I spent weekly meetings with him, experienced some significant healing of the sexual abuse that was underneath that and the trauma, and then experienced a kind of remission with the addiction. And then I got married as a result of that healing. And then 3 years into my marriage, it all came out again. And on July 10th, 1994, we just celebrated over in Scotland the 30th anniversary of that D-Day, where best day of my life and worst day of my life. God did a real miracle. And Julianne wanted to leave and wanted to be away from me. We didn't have kids, but she felt like the Lord was saying, nope, I'm not releasing you to, go live your own life. I have something bigger for you. And we never could have anticipated or predicted that restoring the soul would be the fruit of not just a sex addiction ministry, because we're so much more than that, but the fruit of the brokenness that we meet people in some of the most painful places in their lives and offer a trauma-informed, clinically informed soul care that we've been doing for 24 years now.
Wow. Okay. So there's like 300 interesting things in what you just said. So let's go all the way back to the first piece of advice you get is, hey, listen, or actually you do it first internally in your own mind. I'm a new creation in Christ. Then that's confirmed by a leader. I think I can tell listening to you that isn't what you believe to be true, that was not good counsel. That was actually fairly destructive counsel because it helped you sort of stuff that stuff and it had to come out another way. What would you want to say about that?
Yeah, the thing that's so insidious about that is it's absolutely true that I was a new creation in Christ, but the part that was left off is, and, not but and we are broken as people. And, even if he had said, gosh, thanks for sharing that, let's, pray together and ask God what he wants us to do. But I believe not intentionally and not because this person was malicious, but it's uncomfortable when you're 30 years old and you're leading someone and it's 1983 and a young person comes to you and says, I was sexually abused. I didn't even call it that. Or I'm struggling with lust. There's no categories back then for that. We didn't have the word sexual addiction. We didn't know what we know about trauma. Oprah hadn't gone on national TV and talked about her sexual abuse, nor have other people. So I think it was unfortunate, but probably as good as that person could have done at that time.
Sure.
And ultimately, their heart was for me. And for a long time, I rejected all of that world. But I've come to realize that, I got a seminary education during that 6 years of college because the men that discipled me really poured into me and taught me leadership and a scriptural foundation and a love for God and a relational incarnational ministry that is part of everything that I do. Yep.
And incomplete in thinking about finding wholeness specifically in traumatic experience, right?
Yes.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so I like the way you said that. You said it is true that you're a new creation in Christ, and it's also true that you're broken in certain kinds of ways that need attention. You need to be able to pay attention to those things.
Right.
So, I'll just put my cards on the table on why I've really enjoyed reading your stuff and following you, okay? So I talk to pastors all the time, pretty much all the time at this point. And one of the questions I ask pastors, and I've been asking this question, over 20 years, is what are you doing to help men who are managing, processing pornography addictions, the prevalence of pornography, the sort of sexualization of culture, the vast majority of time. And when I mean the vast majority, I mean nearly 90% of the time. Pastors say either some version of the theological thought you just said, which is, people just need to grow closer to God. The closer they are to God, the more that these other things sort of go away. Number two, if they're honest, they say, honestly, man, literally a pastor in town here when I was moving to plant the church. I asked him just directly, like, what are you doing? It's like 8 out of 10 guys I talk to, they admit this if I ask them directly. Okay. What do you do? He said, oh, Jay, you do not want to lift that rock up. If you lift that rock up, the stuff that comes crawling out of the earth is so crazy, you will not be able to manage it. Here's what you want to do. You want to teach them to worship, have friends, read the Bible, learn to pray, and hopefully you can kind of just crowd that other stuff out. So I think most leaders, if they're paying attention to what we're talking about here at all, they're going, this is so overwhelming. I'm not a clinician. I was mostly trained to like lead Bible studies, pray, help develop leaders, have some coffee, have a decent kids program because I'm a pastor. What do you want to say? Like, how should pastors, leaders be thinking about this stuff? It feels as though the forces against us are so strong, and that's generally why they don't ask. I don't even want to know what's going on in our church,
right.
And I don't want to address what's going on in me. I mean, we can talk about that separate. But how am I supposed to be helpful to people? I don't know how to do this.
You know, this is such a very large and essential question, and I'm so grateful for you and frankly impressed that you're using podcast time to talk about this, because it is a rock that people are saying, I don't want to lift up.
Yep.
You know, I've been an ordained minister for 24 years, taught at a Christian university, adjunct at Denver Seminary. I've been around pastors and Christian leaders for the better part of 30 years. And, you know, the core of our ministry at Restoring the Soul has been clergy and missionaries that we do intensive counseling with. So I have great compassion, and I believe realistic understanding of the world of somebody in ministry. So the first thing, to answer your question, what do I do with that, is realize that you guys already work 2 full-time jobs. I mean, there's no pastoral position that is a full-time job, right? You know, unless you work at a hospice like my friend Aram, and you start at 7 a.m. and finish at 4. But even then, there's funerals and Christmas and concerts and, you know, special calls and
some kind
like
of crisis, but, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So it's 2 full-time jobs. And the minute that you invite somebody to pick up that rock where stuff comes crawling out, you're giving them another full-time job, and that's 3 full-time jobs. Because the first thing that it does is it awakens our own discomfort and shame around the issues of our humanity, which is to say our vulnerability and our dependency upon others, and not just God, but others. And it brings up all of our longings, and it brings up our own shortcomings and potential sin struggles, our sexual wounds. But then it also brings us to a place of powerlessness. And I believe the reason why that leader that said to me, he quoted 2 Corinthians 5:17, he didn't know what else to say.
Right.
So I think most of the time people want to be helpful, but gosh, you just got, you know, it's like you go to see your doctor and you've got something really bad that 2 other doctors haven't figured out, but they've got exactly 4 minutes to treat you, to make chart notes, and to walk out because they've got somebody else. And the most well-intentioned pastor, there's limitations, right? So those are just practical considerations. And so let me gently come back to something you said about, you know, developing leaders. I think at the foundation of developing leaders, there ought to be a commitment, as I know you and others have done, because I know many of the same people as you, that the foundation of leadership development is not about leadership principles for relating to others, but leadership principles for relating to self. And, you know, whenever we think of spirituality, we have to think, because the Trinity is relationship, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and it's triadic. I always think of a triangle, and the base of which is self, and then on the left-hand side, it's others, and then on the right-hand side, it's God. And people might say, well, that's unchristian. You know, why isn't God at the base? And that's because, you know, unless I know myself, I can't really know God. It was Calvin who said there's no knowledge of God without knowledge of self, and no knowledge of self without knowledge of God.
Yes.
But like, how can I be present or practice the presence of God if I can't practice the presence of Michael?
Yes.
And I can't be present to others unless I can practice the presence of Michael. So God's always giving us this capacity for self-awareness, self-reflection, and to break through self-deception that James talks about in chapter 1. And so that really ought to be the foundation of leadership, is self-awareness, emotional intelligence, but specifically an awareness of our brokenness, which is to say our vulnerability. And too much leadership development focuses on our strengths, and it's a strengths-based model versus a weakness-based model. My friend Bill Thrall, who's now 84 or almost 85 years old, who founded Truefaced and years ago wrote a book called The Ascent of a Leader on Josie Bass. It was an academic book. He said he would go to churches and he would ask them to talk about their core values. You know, people would always say, first and foremost, this was back in the days of the kind of Willow Creek emerging. First and foremost, you can guess what I'm going to say. Core value number one, excellence. And he'd say, I was never impressed by that. And I'd always let them get through to the end and then say, what about humility or weakness? What if one of our core values was humility? That the starting point is always our vulnerability, our limitation, our brokenness. And then we actually trust that what Paul said, that we actually boast in our weaknesses. Our boasting actually becomes not about how big we are or successful or how many satellite campuses we have, but rather about where we desperately need Christ, where we have failed, where we're trying to change the world and we can't, and our own foibles and judgments and fantasies and struggles and that kind of thing. Long story short, the invitation to answer your question about what we say to them is, how is it with your own soul, which is an old Methodist greeting. What comes up for you as a parishioner or congregation member or, person you met in the parking lot that not even sure if they're a believer, when they say to you, let's talk about sexuality? Is there an energy to jump in and to defend or to give doctrine or to tell what you believe? Is there an energy to take the guardrails off and just say, hey, it's all good? Is there a tendency to want to fix the person? What reactions and sensations come up in your own body? Because our own story, regardless of whether we have a sexual struggle or not, and I'm putting that in quotes, regardless of whether or not we have sexual trauma, our own story is really what guides us. And all of us have been sexually wounded in the sense that either our masculinity or our femininity or our sense of who we are as sexual beings, as erotic beings, we've not experienced what we were meant to experience.
Okay. So you also framed sort of how we think about these things, used Augustine, which is maybe not a way people are comfortable with or familiar with.
That was Aquinas.
Aquinas, forgive me.
Aquinas is another pathway with sexuality.
He is. That's right. I'm so sorry. Forgive me. I misquoted you, but the idea that you're looking for God in a certain way. So that, of course, I'm referring almost directly to your book, Surfing for God. I was joking before we got on that I'm single-handedly trying to make you into a millionaire. I recommend this book pretty much continually because it's as honest a book and as helpful a book as I found in having some of these conversations. Talk a little bit about that because, when we just think about some of the things we're describing in negative terms, like we're just trying to avoid fill-in-the-blank list of behaviors, that isn't going to get us where we want to go entirely. Now, if that's all the strength you have for today is to just not do something that's going to hurt yourself, good move. But that's not going to get us where we want to go. So talk a little bit about that and how you've seen, as you've helped people and you walk through their stories, reframing what are often terrifying behaviors for ourselves or with others into, no, you're actually looking for God as you're doing these things.
Yeah. Thanks for mentioning the book, and thank you for being such a champion of the book. So the book is called Surfing for God, Discovering the Divine Desire Beneath Sexual Struggle. And that's, taken right from what was allegedly G.K. Chesterton's quote, "The man knocking on the brothel door is knocking for God." And I thought, back when people were still using the term surfing the internet and now not so much, that the person surfing for porn is actually surfing for God. And so again, it was Aquinas who said that every sinful, and sometimes I qualify and say every unhealthy behavior is rooted in a legitimate God-given appetite. I've gone so far as to say, and I don't know if I would die on this hill, that there are no such thing as unholy desires. There are only desires that are misdirected desires. I don't know if it was Thomas Merton or a Celtic saint long before that who said there is only sacred and desecrated, no unsacred things. There are only holy and misdirected desires. So, you know Dallas Willard's writing and teaching, and he's the one who coined the phrase sin management, and that most churches preach a gospel of sin management, and there's nowhere where that probably stands out more explicitly than with sexuality, where we just try to ratchet it down. And I love the quote by surprisingly Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who said the pursuit of purity is not about suppressing our lust, but about reorienting our life to a larger goal. And so it's about what is it that we're seeking? We have to identify the God-given legitimate desire beneath. And I love in Proverbs 27, verse 7, I believe, the writer says that the one who is full loathes honey, but to the one who is hungry, what is bitter tastes sweet. And so we could argue that, pornography looks sweet and sexual acting out looks sweet, but ultimately it becomes bitter, especially when it's discovered or found out, or when our spouse or partner or elder group, learns of this. It's very, very bitter. And the antidote is not to ask Jesus to, help us flex our muscles and to resist sin. And to your point, there's a time and a place for that. But the antidote is to seek out that which fills our soul, that which satisfies our appetite. And I believe that, Christianity, for certainly the 20th and 21st century, the way that we've thought about spirituality is primarily left brain, primarily get more scripture in, experience is bad, which I would disagree with, that we're not feeding people's hearts and souls. Got to sit down with Eugene Peterson back in 95 and publish an interview with him in the old Mars Hill Review, no relation to Mark Driscoll's Mars Hill Review. And remember, he said to me that this was back in 95, and I said, what's your biggest disappointment with the church today? Without hesitating, he said, people are spiritually thin and impoverished. We're not feeding people's hearts. We're just feeding their minds. So to reorient our goal, to reorient our life, rather, to a larger goal, is to move toward something as opposed to away from something. And that doesn't just mean more activity, more energy, more redoubling our efforts or commitment, but to move toward an actual life with God that brings us to a place of rest in our soul. Because every addiction, every affair, every orgasm that's illicit to pornography is seeking and experiencing a moment of rest, a moment of Eden that is available to us in a very real and substantial way in union with God. And, so often we're focused either on doing for God instead of being with God, or we're focused on somehow trusting God in a way that's going to give us breakthrough. But as Martin Laird, who wrote Into the Silent Land, one of my favorite books on the contemplative life, said that union with God is never anything we have to acquire or attain. It's something that we simply fall into, and that most of us are like a person standing on the back of a whale while fishing for minnows. It's all right there. We literally just fall into it. And so I think, again, I keep saying to your question, there's a way of thinking about life with God that is first and foremost about a life that's deeply immersed in union with God, in contemplation and rest. And we're moving more in that direction, thankfully. But there's still a sense where these things are kind of therapeutic, or they're heuristic, that they're done because they make my leadership more effective, as opposed to, and I can live with that. And I think Jesus celebrates that. But there's also a sense in which, no, this is not simply to make us more fruitful and effective. It's actually foundational. And ministry is meant to be Psalm 23, verse 5. Our cup is to overflow. And ministry is to be overflow most of the time, not always, as opposed to standing at the farm well, pumping the handle 1,000 times, trying to get a little bit of living water to come out.
If you're interested in more of the work Vineyard USA is doing to promote healthy pastors and leaders, we'd encourage you to check out the Pastoral Health information page on our website. Go to vineyardusa.org/pastoral health to learn about resources, upcoming cohorts, and support from the Vineyard USA team.
You're reframing what it means to actually have a life with God, let alone do ministry. So, okay. So I'm listening right now, and I'm speaking rhetorically. I'm not saying I actually am, but if I'm listening right now and I'm going, man, I have got these secret things I'm not sure what to do with, and I'm tamping them down. I can go, you gave the example, I can go a full 2 weeks without anything going wrong or whatever. This is the kind of weird math you start doing. I can go
absolutely.
2 full weeks without screwing up. And isn't that great? It used to be 5 days. Now it's 2 weeks or whatever. And I've got my flip charts, and by every appearance, I'm super disciplined. And now as I'm listening to you, man, it's starting to poke holes in how I'm thinking. And I'm starting to realize, wait a minute, maybe this isn't how it's supposed to be. But now what do I do? Because, gosh, I don't want to go to one of those therapists that is going to tell me I'm a new creation, or the pastor. I'm afraid I'm going to get bad advice. I'm afraid I'm going to end up exposed. I could get fired. Maybe what if I get fired for talking about what's going on? How do you help people out of that trap?
Yeah, well, first of all, I was a intern professor in 1994 when everything blew apart in my life, and I was actually 2 weeks out of my contract. The contract ended June 30th, and July 10th is when everything blew up. And many people may know the name Dan Allender, but also Larry Crabb, Dr. Larry Crabb, who both of them were my mentors at Colorado Christian. And Larry was my boss, and he was also my counselor and soul friend. And I didn't tell him over the course of the 2 years where I was an intern, because I knew I would lose my job. I was afraid and I was ashamed. And then the contract ended, and boom, 10 days later, it all came out. So that's a very, very real fear.
Yeah.
And, evil will use fear because fear is antithetical to love. And it's not just us loving God, but the problem with hidden sin is that it keeps God's love out. It was Andy Comiskey, dear friend of the Vineyard, years ago, who said that shame is like a raincoat over the soul that repels the living water of Jesus that would establish us as the beloved. And so believe anyone, I'll say two things. Anyone who's struggling right now, or this is starting to poke holes in how they've done life. Number one, sexual struggles, whether it is, an affair, pornography, compulsive masturbation, whatever it might be, cyber sex, online stuff. The problem is not about sex. The problem is simply not about sex. Peterson in the Message in 1 Corinthians 6:14 paraphrased the passage about, do you not know that if you join yourself with a prostitute? And he started it saying, sex is more than mere skin on skin. It's as much spiritual mystery as physical fact. And so the point there is that none of our sexual reality is fundamentally physical or sexual. It's spiritual. It's emotional. It's embodied, but it's not just, I'm too horny or I'm too sexual or, something like that. It's about something much, much deeper that God actually wants to use our sexuality as the springboard to get to our heart and to our soul, to release something really, really good. Second thing I would say is that shame is a lie. Shame is a lie. Shame is a lie. Shame is a lie. Shame is not from the God that looks like Jesus. Jesus said in John 15, if you have seen the Father, you have seen me. So the God that Christians believe in looks like Jesus. And Jesus does not shame. And particularly, he does not shame the sexually broken. We see that, all throughout Scripture. He embraces, he redeems, he empowers, he loves, he holds. And yet the voice of shame will be so loud and so insidious and so persistent with the exact things you said. I will lose my job. I will lose my relationship. I can't bear being known, being exposed. What if? I can still feel in my body. 36 years later, I can still feel in my body what I felt on that day right before I called the Christian counselor when I saw in the newspaper that the FBI had raided the escort service. A deep, deep pit in my stomach and feeling for, 24 hours that I was going to vomit, and my face was red and my heart was racing and I was shaky and it felt like I had low blood sugar. That's what shame does. It's the most embodied of all our potential experiences. And it's not, as you and your listeners probably well know, it's not that I've done something bad. That's guilt. Shame says I am bad. I am unworthy. I am fundamentally flawed and unlovable, which goes against the Christian good news, at every single step of the way.
Yeah.
And yet we hide in shame. Third thing I would say is that the problem is not actually the sin. The problem is the hiddenness and the refusal or the inability to step out of hiddenness into being known. It's interesting. 1 John says that if we walk in the light, then we have fellowship with one another. And most of us skip over that part about we have fellowship with one another. We say if we walk in the light, the blood of Jesus cleanses us and purifies us.
We skip all the way. Yeah, right.
Yeah, but what that means is my capacity to be known and to be intimate by God and others and my knowledge of self will profoundly increase because there's no longer shame attached to it, because that's not the gospel.
Yeah. And so what would you have said to you? Like, as you're trapped, you're in that counseling job, you're an intern, you're afraid you're going to get fired.
Yeah, well, let me tell you a true story.
Yeah.
And this is the story. We were talking a little bit about this. I have a book coming out January 7th with InterVarsity Press called Sacred Attachment, Escaping Spiritual Exhaustion and Trusting Divine Love. And I open one of the chapters with this. And I'll preface this with, I think we need to have a new understanding of sin. That there's a song by the popular secular group Bastille, and the song is Pompeii. Oh, 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 oh. And the line is, where do we begin, the rubble or the sin? And I would argue that, for the last 150 years in modern Christianity, especially in the West, we've begun with sin, 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 sin. It's all about, we're sinners, God is holy. And I think that over the last 20 or 30 years, there's been momentum gathering and needs to continue to increase, that we begin in the rubble. We begin in talking about our brokenness and our frayed humanity and our shame and our pain and the places where we so desperately need healing. And that our sin is actually the sum of our weakness, which is our liability and limitation, our woundedness, which is the ways that we've been impacted and pained and traumatized by others, the warfare that comes against us, which are the lies that we believe about God and ourselves and about relationships. Primarily, God is not good and can't really be trusted, and that we can be God. And then the tertiary belief that vulnerability is a bad thing instead of a good thing. I mean, our whole culture is about don't be vulnerable, but God created us to be vulnerable. And to the degree that we hide that, we become compulsive and addicted. And so the story is, shortly before I was caught in my double life on July 10th, I won't go into the whole story, but I had a job in mental health where I had a pager and I was on call, and I would lie to my wife and, tell her that I was at the hospital working, doing mental health assessments. And on this particular night, I lied, and I wasn't doing that. And I was at an adult bookstore that actually is now a Costco. They tore the place down and paid over it, which is kind of nice. And every time I go to that Costco, I'm like, oh, thanks be to God.
Yeah.
I was in this adult bookstore, and I'm feeding coins into the video machine. And of course, to watch pornography. This was before the internet, before Al Gore invented the internet. And
right.
And I ran out of coins, and I was still desperate in my acting out. And I even went to the guy at the counter, and is there any way like you could give me some more tokens? And so men had been in there all day, and this may sound really disgusting, but it's a part of my story. I got down on my knees, and I'm on the floor, and I can still smell the antiseptic, janitorial smell of the mop and the bucket. And I'd been around there enough for enough years to know at these places that, men are rushing in and out of there. And so there's coins or tokens on the floor. And I got together some tokens, and I put them in, and I acted out. And I left there going, my God, what has become of me? Who am I? I hated what I was doing. And a couple of days later, I remember, I think I was getting dressed, heading to a meeting, and I had this, you're Vineyard, so you're not going to go, whoa, that's weird. But I had this vision. It was this walking vision in my mind, and Jesus was there. He took me back to a couple of days ago in the adult bookstore where I was hating myself, and he was kneeling down next to me as I was kneeling on this wet, sticky floor. And his arm was around me, and he was saying with pure compassion and kindness, of course, Michael, of course. And it wasn't the English schoolmaster with his glasses down on the end of his nose, perched looking disapprovingly, of course, like, of course, you're shooting spitballs. It was the of course of a parent saying, of course, with your story, how else could it be? But Michael, just wait 6 weeks. It's going to hurt even worse. And you're going to watch the pain that you will have caused and that your choices will have made this horrible impact. But I'm going to do something that you never, ever, ever imagined. And it actually takes my breath away on a regular basis. When you're talking about having people buy my book, that day and that kind of shame and failure and humiliation and brokenness and sin has led to countless people being given hope and healing in a lot of different ways, in ways that I'll never, ever know until eternity. And so if we are willing to trust love, and if we're willing to surrender our control, if we're willing to, quote, do whatever it takes and respond to Jesus' invitation in Luke 9 and other places that says, if we're willing to lose our life, we will find something that is the pearl of great price, that we will find an abundance and a life and a joy and a freedom and a rest in our soul that Jesus promised. That's the whole thing. That's something more compelling. That's a reality that actually fills our hearts. Amen. So that we no longer then have to eat what is bitter because we think that it tastes sweet.
Amen. Okay, so I'm buying everything you're selling, by the way, and I think most people would be. So let me think about one other thing. So then you get caught, all these horrible things are happening. You start to do some work to repair that. How do you think we work to restore people? So, okay, what tends to happen in a lot of ministry environments is we shoot our wounded. Okay, so once you're revealed for being broken and messed up, you're gone. It's like, okay, that's it. You're gone forever. We don't really know what to do. It's so shocking. Often in a church context, it's so damaging, where people's trust is lost and marriages and families are impacted. Give us some hope. Give us some hopeful stories in some ways that we see things transform and repair.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure if you listen to Carey Nieuwhof. He's somebody who I've admired from a distance, and I have a couple friends that are close friends with him. But recently I was driving very, very early morning airport trip, traveling somewhere, and I turned on his podcast with one of my heroes, Gordon MacDonald. Gordon MacDonald, has written 30 books. He was the president of InterVarsity Christian Fellowship back in the mid 80s. He had just written what was probably the first big breakaway mega seller book, Ordering Your Private World. So Carey Nieuwhof has Gordon on his podcast, and Gordon's been on my podcast when he was around Denver Seminary more often. And I believe he's 84 now. And Gordon never talked explicitly about it, even though it was in the news at the same time as Jimmy Swaggart seeing prostitutes and Jim and Tammy Faye Baker with the PTO club and their scandals sexually. And Jim went to jail. And right around that same time, Gordon didn't get caught, but came forward and confessed that years earlier, he had had an illicit sexual relationship while traveling. It wasn't a long-term affair. And he stepped down or got fired from InterVarsity. I don't remember which. And contrary to Jimmy Swaggart and Jim Baker, Gordon did something that was unprecedented at the time. He found 2 or 3 people, and I know one of the people who did this, who he said, my wife and I are walking off the map. We're leaving ministry. We're not saying we're going to come back in a year. We don't know if we will come back, but they went and lived at their home in New Hampshire called Peace Ledge. He wrote a book about it called Rebuilding Your Broken World. And it's one of the best books around on this subject. It's not about infidelity. It's not about affairs. It's just about when your world falls apart. And as I was listening to Carey in this podcast, 40 years after the fact, I'm thinking, here's a man who's 84 who was at the height of success in the Christian world with this book, and everybody wanted him. And he said that he came to realize that he had to come face to face with what it's like to live with an empty soul. And that's what led to his journey. But what happened was he took 3 years and disappeared. He didn't, blog or have a podcast 6 months out saying, here's what I've learned. Just disappeared for 3 years.
Yeah.
And let people love him and love he and his wife, and read books and reflected and developed depth and wholeness, so that the next half of Gordon's life has been one of, yes, some positions of leadership and authority, but mostly a kind of influence of one-on-one relationships and speaking to the world, not about how to grow a bigger church or how to be a more productive leader, but how to grow depth and how to live connected to our own soul. So that's a story that I've seen play out over 40 years. And that's why Gordon is one of my heroes, because he was willing to walk away. And I think the pull and the compulsion for those of us like myself that are addicted to ministry, and I'm an Enneagram 2, so I'm addicted to helping and to giving and being indispensable. It is so hard to not have that dopamine shot of getting up to preach or leading a Bible study or a small group or something like that. And so sometimes we begin to deal with those issues when our world falls apart from something like, unexpected divorce, or from sexual addiction or brokenness or alcohol abuse or an anger issue. So many of my friends who are pastors, especially since COVID, their anger, their irritability, their moodiness, and how that plays out in relationships, that's what has kind of taken them out.
Yep.
And, who would have thought 40 years ago, when people like Gordon were losing their church, that would be an issue today? Because if you were the pastor, you had the right to be angry and tell people what to do. But hey, maybe that's not exactly like Jesus.
Right.
So God wants to use our brokenness to draw us more deeply into who we were meant to be. And I like to say that our brokenness is not the barrier to the life that we want. It's the bridge to the life that we want.
Wow.
When it is surrendered, when we say, here, God, take this brokenness and trust God with it. I think it was Willard who said this. Most of us trust in Christ, but we don't trust Christ, right? Like in this present moment, I'm not sure I can trust you with this. Yeah. I've got this, thanks. And I'm sure familiar with that dynamic. I'm preaching to the choir.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So we're a group of pastors, leaders, trying to help each other. What should we be doing in our own lives? What should we be doing as we're together with one another? What are the kind of conversations we should have? How do we support one another? How do we do this? What would you recommend?
Well, I love the model of pastors getting away with people that they're not leading and having just friends to go do stuff that's not ministry.
Isn't that sad that we have to tell people that, right?
Well, yeah, but I'm also a guy that, if you'd asked me for 25 years, what hobbies do I have? I would say, well, here's what I aspire to. I aspire to go fly fishing. I aspire to, even though I have a $6,000 mountain bike in my garage, not now, but then, I aspire to be a mountain biker.
Right.
That's just the nature of my addictions and compulsions. But so it's just important to get away, to play. But more importantly, I would say that there's 3 things that take me back to the triangle: friendship, authenticity, and mission. Friendship on 3 levels. Friendship would be the base of the triangle. Friendship with myself, friendship with God, and friendship with others. And oftentimes we're in friendship with other people, and we don't have the freedom to operate out of the friendship with ourselves. There's parts of ourselves that we've had to disown, parts of ourselves that we've had to relegate, parts of ourselves we've had to compartmentalize. And see, if I'm fly fishing with people that are in my congregation who I'm preaching to on Sunday morning, it may not be appropriate or safe to share this, and I might not have a job. But if I have friends that are simply peers, maybe if there's a history attached to it, or if I've been intentional to develop friendships with local peers, and we're not primarily getting together to talk about leadership or theology, but just to be together as people, then I can be known. And that friendship with myself leads to compassion. I have a little soapbox lately. Colossians 3 is a big chapter for me. And in the NIV, it has a little heading where it says rules for holy living. And it talks about, setting our heart and our mind on Christ above. And then it talks about putting off the old self and putting on the new self. And then there's paragraph break. And it says, therefore, we all know what therefore means, clothe yourself with compassion, humility, kindness, gentleness, and patience. And I'd read that, Jay, for years, thinking that it was telling me to clothe other people with compassion, humility, gentleness, and kindness. So we need to have spaces in our life where we can be clothed in compassion, humility, gentleness, and kindness, and where we're able to do that ourselves. And that generally only happens in a context where we can be known by others. As we are given that compassion, kindness, and gentleness, and patience, not for what we're producing or for the sermon that we gave last week or for how much people think I'm funny, but just for who we are, when we can be naked and unashamed. That allows us to give ourselves that compassion, which then allows us to be more deeply rooted and established in God's love. So that friendship is at the basis, then authenticity with myself. Yeah. It's surprising how many times in the New Testament in particular, there's the category of self-deception that we see in James chapter 1. Long before we ever deceive anyone else, like I did, I deceived myself. Gerald May said that self-deception is the chief characteristic of all addiction. And so knowledge of self and brutal honesty with self requires a humility before God, but it also requires an authenticity with others that when I'm known, that then helps me to be more authentic with myself, which allows me to be more loved by God. And that becomes an interaction. So authenticity is key. And then finally, mission. And mission is not, I exist to build the church of Christ and to expand the kingdom of God and make Jesus disciples. That's like a vocation.
Right.
But a mission is for my personal mission statement is to help create connections with ourselves, with God, and with one another. And that mission is first and foremost something that is what I do in my life. That's why I get out of bed in the morning. And if I'm not doing that myself, then I'm in danger.
Right.
And so our mission should always be formational and not operational. It needs to be developmental, having to do with ourselves. My mission is to live loved. My mission is to be known. My mission is to overflow and to not be giving and ministering out of a place of emptiness in hopes that if I succeed at ministry, then it will fill me up. But to live out of fullness, the broken parts of my heart are brought together, and therefore love doesn't leak out. But rather my heart becomes a container that can actually hold on to love.
That's really good. And I mean, and like I've said up to this point, you keep saying, to your question, I keep saying, I agree with you and I'm buying. So I agree. What do you, so I like the idea of hobbies. It's the number one question I ask pastors when I'm with them. How do you have fun? What's fun for you? And if they say, oh, I prayer walk, I'm like, oh no, that's a bad sign. You're right. You're in trouble. You're in trouble. Or no, I mean, we take our vacation. We go on this. We go to this conference, and we get a day at the hotel. I'm like, no, that's also not a vacation. That doesn't work. So, and you've given us a bunch of good resources. I love Gerald May's work. Obviously, Andy Cusick, a good friend of the Vineyard and in the Vineyard forever. So there's all kinds of good resources in there too that we'll try and throw in the show notes. But maybe as we finish, what do you think? I mean, this is a huge question, but give me the simplest thought you can have, because I know I've taken a lot of your time. You were talking about sticking coins in a machine. Well, now the machine streams into our homes. It streams onto my computer, onto my phone, my kids' computers and phones, everyone in our churches' computers and phones. And I guess we're just sort of hoping they'll have the restraint when they've had a horrible day and everything's sad and they're on the road away from their family and or their family's not there, that everyone will just continually watch sermons. That's really what we're hoping. No, I'm just kidding. We're listening to worship music or whatever. Do you have just some practical wisdom? Because it just feels insurmountable, whether you're a spouse or a parent or just even in your own life. But what are you seeing that's helping people think about rightful use?
I remember when smartphones really, really, really took off, and John Foreman, the lead singer and founder of Switchfoot, wrote a song called Ghost Machine, and it's on one of the albums that's like a 4-album acoustic set. I think it's called Seasons. And when I read that, it's basically how take an idea taken from my book, and I have no idea if he's read my book. It talked about how porn promises us something, and whether we're reading the New York Times or Fox News or anything in between, or doing a crossword puzzle on our phone, that it's promising us something. It's promising to fill us, to energize us, to give us a dopamine hit. It's promising that momentary sense of, I've got this. I'm here in this moment, and here's something that's nurturing and nourishing me. Now, I'm not Amish. I'm not anti-technology, but I went 1 week. I got back from Scotland hiking 100 kilometers with my wife and a group doing a spiritual pilgrimage on St. Cuthbert's Way. I got back a week ago Friday, and I decided I wasn't going to look at any news. And I probably spend 90 minutes a day easily looking at all my different news apps and reading articles. And part of that is for work, and part of it is just because I'm addicted. Right. And I went for 6 or 7 days, and I just found myself breathing. So there's two separate issues. One is technology in general and the very intentional addictive algorithms and technology that is there to captivate us and to ensnare us in its use to generate income. And that is not a conspiracy theory. That is a fact. And, there's all kinds of books written about that.
Yep.
The second thing is just the power of sexuality. And so this sounds so simple, but I would say that we have to step back from time to time and ask the question, are we being intentional about our use of our technology, and in particular our smartphones? And can we be really, really honest about that? And then are we willing to take steps? My favorite author on this subject is Andy Crouch, who wrote a book called Tech-Wise Families. And Andy's just brilliant. I've got a couple podcasts with him talking about this because he's so realistic about this, and he's a consumer of information of the internet, but even things like, having a basket and leaving your phone down on the kitchen counter and keeping it out of your bedroom and things like that. And it's just so easy to be so compulsive. But I think I'll end with this. In Proverbs chapter 22, it says, the paths of the wicked are filled with thorns and snares. And I know that word wicked can be, very activating for people, but let's just say the paths of the ones who are moving away from God instead of toward God are filled with thorns and snares, but the one who guards their soul stays far from them. And so a snare is the biblical picture par excellence of addiction. You step into a snare without knowing it, and it catches you, and the harder you try to get out of it, the tighter it gets. That's an addiction. Yep. And the Bible always equates a snare with idolatry in the Old Testament and the New Testament. But there's an antidote, and it says to guard our soul. And our soul, in the Hebrew classic idea of soul, it's not the Greek idea of mind, emotions, and will. It's the body, the mind, the emotions, and the will. So embodied spirituality, which is a whole other subject and a big topic that I handle in my new book. Embodied spirituality is something that begins with bodily self-awareness, somatic awareness, breathing, rhythms of rest, exercise, certainly diet, but just paying attention to our physical bodies, knowing that our spiritual life can only go as deep as our spirituality is embodied. Because our body is the incarnational mediator, if you will, of all of our spiritual and human experience.
That's really good. And what I love about what you're saying is it is practical. Like, this isn't some esoteric, magical set of things that happen. There are choices to be made. There's ways to guard yourself, but also feast well. Like, find ways that you get your needs met. I can't tell you how grateful I am for the time. This is really, really, really helpful, and you've given us a lot of time. And we live in the same city, so hopefully we can hang out at some point. I'd love to keep picking your brain. And I don't mountain bike, but I do golf.
Well, neither do I. That's the funny thing.
Okay. Well, I'll throw a rod around here and there. So yeah, maybe that would work. But I'm really, really grateful. Really grateful for the work you're doing. Looking forward to reading this book that's coming out, and we'll stick it all in the liner notes. Hopefully I can come back and bother you again someday. I would love that.
I would love that. Yeah, you can go to Amazon right now and pre-order the book, Sacred Attachment. And January 7th is when it comes out. And hey, let's get together for breakfast or something like that. I would love to finally meet you face to face, Jay.
I'd love that. That would be great. All right. Well, bless you. I really, really do appreciate it.
Really fun to talk with you.
As we celebrate our 50-year anniversary in the Vineyard, if you're interested in learning more about Vineyard history, there are plenty of resources for you. Check out our show notes for links to books, YouTube videos, and more to learn about Vineyard history and identity. And make sure to keep listening to the podcast this year for stories of Vineyard churches throughout the year.